The midday sun blazed over the Athenian agora as citizens pressed together, their eyes fixed on a wooden platform where a single man stood, silent, awaiting judgment. Punishment in Athens was never hidden. Executions, when they occurred, were carried out in public view, sometimes on the agora itself, so that ordinary citizens could not ignore the lesson. The theater of death. In the city that birthed democracy, punishment was no less theatrical than its tragedies. Athens had no towering prisons and no isolated gallows hidden from sight. Justice unfolded in the open, where every strike of a lash or clang of a chain reinforced the city's laws. The courts of Athens, often numbering hundreds of citizen jurors, delivered sentences in full daylight. When exile or fines were deemed too lenient, harsher punishments followed. Executions in Greece were rarely private affairs. They were civic events designed to imprint fear and obedience. But unlike Rome, which later elevated bloodshed into mass entertainment, the Athenians cloaked their punishments in civic dignity. The crowd was meant not just to shudder, but to internalize the lesson. And yet, beneath this veneer of order, the cruelty was unmistakable. Poison and the silent chamber. Perhaps the most infamous form of execution was the cup of hemlock. Reserved for citizens, philosophers, generals, politicians, it was seen as a dignified death. But dignity was an illusion. The condemned drank the poison under supervision, often with guards present. Sometimes, as in the case of Socrates in the year 399 BCE, even friends and students were allowed to witness his final moments. Hemlock's alkaloids crept slowly through the body, first numbing the feet, then the legs, until the victim's chest stiffened, the lungs paralyzed, and the heart faltered. Plato described how Socrates calmly drank the poison, yet even in his stoic acceptance, the agony was visible. The gradual loss of movement, the cold crawling upward, the collapse into silence. Athenians insisted this was civilized compared to the lash or the axe. But for the condemned, the end was slow suffocation, and this was only one method: shackles, whips, and the slave's end. For non-citizens, slaves, and foreigners, punishments were stripped of dignity. Their deaths were not quiet. They were noisy, violent, and humiliating. Whipping was the universal prelude. Bound to wooden posts in the marketplace, slaves endured lashes that tore through skin and muscle. Ancient writers recorded that the number of strokes could be symbolic: 50, 100, sometimes enough to kill outright. If death did not come from the whip, harsher measures followed. Crucifixion, borrowed from Persia and later perfected by Rome, was occasionally inflicted on rebellious slaves or captured enemies in the Greek world, though it was never as systematized as it later became under the Romans. The condemned was tied, or nailed, to a cross-like structure, raised at crossroads or city gates, where bodies hung until vultures stripped them bare. This was not Athenian civility. This was raw, brutal deterrence. Pits, rocks, and the earth's cold grip. In Sparta, famed for discipline, execution took harsher, primitive forms. Traitors and enemies of the state were hurled into the Chiadas, a pit near Mount Taygetus. The rocky chasm swallowed men alive, leaving them to die of starvation or broken bones in the darkness below. This abyss was more than punishment. It was symbolic erasure. By casting a body into the void, Spartans denied the condemned proper burial rites, an eternal dishonor in Greek belief, where the unburied soul wandered restless forever. Even in Athens, execution by stoning was known, though less formalized. A criminal condemned by the assembly could be dragged outside the walls, where stones rained down from a furious crowd. The weight of justice, quite literally, was measured in rock and bone. The public gaze. What made Greek executions uniquely horrifying was not just the method, but the gaze. Crowds gathered not in secrecy, but in full civic participation. Children stood on tiptoe, merchants paused their trade, philosophers themselves sometimes observed, taking note of how fear molded society. Aristotle, in his Politics, remarked that punishment was the teacher of obedience, a spectacle that bound the community together through shared horror. Imagine the silence before the lash fell, the murmur as the condemned was dragged forward, the eruption of voices as the first blood spilled. These were not hidden reckonings with law. They were civic performances, or at least they were remembered and described that way, meant to inscribe obedience on every witness. And if Athens made executions public lessons, other polis, from Corinth to Syracuse, developed their own, far more terrifying methods. Execution by the sea. The Greeks were a seafaring people, and some ancient accounts suggest the sea itself sometimes became an execution ground. Naval deserters, pirates, or captured enemies might be cast overboard, drowned before the eyes of their comrades. Others may have been displayed on ships to mark their disgrace. For a Greek, whose culture revolved around seafaring and the gods of the deep, death in the water without funeral rites was among the most feared fates. Public punishments at harbors ensured the lesson spread beyond the polis itself. Foreign traders and sailors carried tales of Greek severity across the Aegean. The Brazen Bull of Sicily. In Greek colonies of the West, cruelty took on grotesque invention. In Acragas, on the island of Sicily, a tyrant named Phalaris commissioned an execution device that became infamous even among the ancients, the Brazen Bull. A massive bronze statue, hollow within, was fashioned in the shape of a bull. The condemned was forced inside, the door sealed, and a fire lit beneath. As the metal heated, the victim was roasted alive. But the true horror lay in its design. A system of pipes and valves transformed the victim's screams into bellowing sounds. To the crowd, it was not human agony they heard, but the roars of a beast. Ancient authors, including Diodorus Siculus, record that even the inventor of the device was eventually forced to suffer death in his own creation. The Brazen Bull was not a legend of medieval cruelty. It was an invention of the Greek world, paraded before cheering crowds. Ostracism and the mockery of mercy. Not every punishment ended in death. Sometimes the cruelty lay in exile, a civic ritual called ostracism. Citizens scribbled a name onto shards of pottery known as ostraca. When enough votes accumulated, the condemned was banished from Athens for 10 years. At first glance, exile seems merciful. But for an Athenian, separation from the city meant separation from identity itself. To be cast out of the polis was a living death, a punishment that stripped one of family, friends, and the civic body. And yet, exile was preferable to the fates reserved for slaves or foreigners. To them, the full weight of physical execution was unleashed. The theater of torture. While Rome later perfected torture as prelude to execution, the Greeks too saw its use, particularly against non-citizens. Interrogation under the lash was standard practice for slaves, whose testimony in court was only considered valid if extracted through pain. Later sources describe gruesome methods such as breaking bones with clubs or exposing the condemned on wooden frames. Whether these were widely practiced in Greece remains debated, but the idea of extending suffering before death was not unknown. Herodotus records impalement among the Persians. Later writers suggest that Greek cities may at times have adopted similar terrors, whether literally or as threats meant to deter rebellion. These methods were not hidden in dungeons. They were staged in open squares, the polis transformed into an amphitheater of suffering. The ritual of shame. In a world where honor was life itself, humiliation was often intertwined with death. Criminals might be paraded naked through the streets before execution, their names proclaimed publicly, their crimes shouted so all could hear, ensuring that even after death, dishonor lingered. Bodies were sometimes denied burial, left exposed to scavengers. In Greek belief, this was the ultimate punishment. The soul, unburied, wandered restless, barred from the peace of Hades. Sophocles' tragedy Antigone turned on precisely this terror, that denying burial was worse than killing itself. Thus, execution was not just physical destruction, it was annihilation of memory, of dignity, of the very possibility of rest. From justice to spectacle. Why did the Greeks turn justice into public theater? The answer lies in control. Public executions reminded citizens of the fragility of order. They warned slaves that rebellion meant torment. They warned generals that defeat could mean poison or the pit. They warned foreigners that the city's laws were inexorable. But above all, they ensured that punishment was never private. Every death was a civic lesson, a visible scar carved into collective memory. And here lies the most horrific truth. In ancient Greece, execution was not only about ending a life, it was about performing power before an audience.